presentation, it talks about Workday recruiting and things you need to do to prep for it. So, you know, in the last session, we saw different decisions that needed to be made and how to configure by going into the tenant setup. And we had to like either make a particular choice within the edit tenant system or edit recruiting or edit HCM, and we made different decisions. So this one particular presentation, this is actually by Workday. It talks about the different considerations that companies should go through for preparing for Workday. So, and then the reason I want to go through this with you guys is so that given that this module is very huge, this document, or what we'll go through, will give you all of the talking points that you need to consider in as part of the new implementation, or things that you need to be aware of, like these are the decisions that have been made if you're supporting an implementation that's already done. But these are the key things that you need to ask for, like what were the decisions made in these particular areas. So from that perspective, while it's not actually going into the system, but I think it's good awareness of things we need to be aware of for recruiting implementation. Okay. So this particular slide, it talks about staffing models, and recruiting could use both position management and job management, but the company needs to decide which one they're going to go with. I'll talk about the pros and cons of each. So if you need to do a lot of hiring and you need to do a lot of fast hiring, like in a retail environment where there's a lot of turnover, you should use job management. Also, if you're a agile company like in a Silicon Valley and there's a lot of flexibility and you do not need a lot of control, then you should be using job management. If the company wants to have a very controlled process where you have an approval flow and you could only hire within certain cost centers, certain orgs, and you need a department head to approve each time before you create a position or you hire someone, in that case, you should use position management. The step to hire someone is longer when you use position management, and it's also a little bit more cumbersome. Like every time you do a promotion or you do a termination, you have to deal with what are you going to do with that position that will be left behind in case of a termination or a transfer. So if the company wants to be nimble and fast as far as this hiring process, then they should be using job management and not position management. And the end product of that is that you have what's called a position, and then you could hire against that position. If you don't have position management, then you just go to the organization and then you just say, hey, hire someone. And job requisitions are required for Workday recruiting. So the things we want to consider is, do you want to require job requisitions for organizations using position management, or do you want to require job requisitions based on specific rules? Or do you want to use job requisitions for organizations using job management? And then also the numbering scheme. Typically companies just start with R and some sequence that starts with something. So this is, we saw yesterday where you set this up within the Workday application. And we also saw the ability to override the hiring restrictions. Whether or not a company is going to have job requisition compensation as part of it. So there is a step within the process in which you could allow the recruiter or someone to enter the salary, the proposed salary, I should say. So that is a decision point, because that page where you enter the compensation is optional. You could add it or not based on that decision. And if the company decides not to, they could easily change it going forward in the future. So this is about the compensation page, whether it should be added or not. No, so there is a page. The page is called like request comp, and on that one is you enter what, you have the salary range, and if there's going to be any kind of like bonus or something. So that page, it needs to be made part of the requisition process if you do want it that way. There's something called evergreen requisitions. So if companies that are doing a lot of hiring, like retail, they might enable this evergreen requisitions. These are basically, they're not tied to any particular position, but you create this requisition so you could just have candidates against it. And you could move the candidate to job requisitions and back to evergreen if necessary. So you collect all the candidates against your evergreen requisition. So the reason it's called evergreen, right? Like this is green always, like this is open always. So candidates could apply to it. And then you take the candidate from your evergreen requisition and then you attach it to your actual job requisition. So you don't have to keep on opening up a new rec every time you need to collect more resumes, especially in a fast hiring environment. Yeah, this is part of a functionality just called Evergreen, and you have to use it for high volume, high turnover, or highly specialized jobs. If you have a candidate against the Evergreen, you cannot make an offer or hire from an Evergreen requisition. So you have to move them to a regular job requisition. Another big point is job profile data, such as job description and qualifications, should they be automatically pre-populated on the job requisition? So that means, like, if you have a particular job profile called business analyst, there should be some kind of description of what is a business analyst, and then you would consider, like, if you want to default in that job description on the job requisition. So in order to do that, the company should have job descriptions and summaries so that when they create the job requisition, it will default in. If they don't have that, then the recruiter has to enter the description or the summary at the time of creating the requisition. Within recruiting, you don't have to create the job profile because this should be actually just part of the HCM process, that there are job profiles. But if a company is using recruiting, they need to decide if they're going to pre-populate the job description and the qualifications for each job profile so that it would pre-populate on the requisition. So this shows that you have a particular job profile, for example, administrative, and it has a job family. that's linked to that job profile. And then there is a tab called job classifications. And there's also a job profile summary, description, and additional description. So if you enter information here on the job profile, then it will default into the requisition. If there is no information here, then it won't. So this is within the HCM system. You could look up an employee, and then on their job page, you will see their job profile and the job code. And then from there, you could dig, that would be an active hyperlink. And you could, from that page, you could go into the job profile data. You can see all of the data on that for that job profile. So navigate from the employee job and then into the job details. That's one way. You could also search for job profile as a report. I'm sure there's some report already called job profiles. And there are certain fields which you could change the label, and in order to show to the external candidates, you want to make a little bit of a more user-friendly label. So for example, you might have location, and the location might make sense to an employee, but that location name may not make sense to an external person. So you could change the label of the location so they're more user-friendly. And also certain terms, there's something called maintain labels. So you could change what Workday calls it, and you could give it a more user-friendly label. And that's what that label will show up to the external workers. One thing to make sure is that some labels, if you change them in one place, they will not only change for the external, but they will change for everywhere else globally. Even, so other people who are using Workday, they need to be aware that you're making a change to the label. So here's an example, like you may have a location name called building 123, which may make sense to an internal employee, but candidates, for them, on that location field, you could change it to something that's more descriptive. So this shows that on the create location, on that same page, at the bottom, it says default job posting location. So you have location, and then you have job posting location. It is the same location, but whatever name that's given in the job posting location is what will show up on the external requisitions or external job posting. So a company needs to decide to go ahead and update all of their locations with more candidate-friendly labels. In this example, is saying that on a worker summary, when an internal candidate applies, it makes sense to allow the employee to have what's called a upload my by default. This widget called my experience or education or job history, this may not be available. That's too big. So on this employee profile, by default, a lot of companies don't have these areas, education or job history or a way to upload their resume. But if they're going to be using recruiting, or if they are using recruiting, it makes sense to enable these sections as well. So that's what this is talking about, that. So that when the employee applies for the job, this is the information that gets pulled into that profile. So if there's nothing here, then it's not going to pull anything. And then there's something called questionnaires. And you can have a separate questionnaire for external candidates versus internal. And these are questions that are designed to ask the candidate some particular questions to see if they're really qualified for that job. And based on what they answer, they could be disqualified. So it's saying that you should prepare some questionnaires if they're going to use them or they're not going to use them. But this is something, there's functionality to be implemented. And it could have up to 25 questions per questionnaire. I think that would be a little too much. And then it talks about the Workday recruiting. You know, it has that dynamic job application process. So you want to make sure that you consider all of the different steps and the flow, and make sure you know who are all the stakeholders in that process, so you could build them into the process flow. So we'll look at that in a little bit. But this is a screenshot of the, that dynamic job requisition business flow. And it's giving an example of where you could actually have steps that someone could review and make edits. So like in this one, there's a step for the recruiter to review the job requisition. And there's a step called request requisition compensation if they're going to utilize comp. And if there's going to be, there's also assigned roles. So when you're creating a requisition, there, if you want to have a step to indicate who will be the recruiter and who will be the recruiting administrator. So that's another step. We will see that when we're creating a requisition, it will ask us to assign roles. And then there's a job posting step where you indicate for this requisition where it's going to be posted to. Similarly, this one is the job requisition one. There's a closed job requisition business process with certain criteria that needs to be thought out of how the workflow is going to be. Then it talks about things to consider. Workday allows you to make an external career site. You could have more than one. Typically, companies have one Workday hosted external site and one internal website. But both of these websites will be hosted by Workday, and you'll have the link within Workday. But you could definitely configure that career site with your own logo and colors and branding, and put videos on it, have analytics running on it. So here's an example of the template for the external career site. You could put a logo. This could also be a video now. This is a new functionality. I think it just came out in the last, not this release, but the release before. You could have a video running or a banner, and this search criteria that should show up on the left-hand side, and a login page and a language selection. So things you could do on that, you could have your own banners, logo, analytics, if you need any terms and conditions, like a cookie policy message. Do you want to force the candidate to create an account, or you want to keep that as an optional step? So those are all the things to consider when creating an external site. And then obviously there's also the About Us message, resume parsing message, and country-specific terms and conditions. This is also optional to have a candidate home. It could be an optional where they could create an account after someone submits an application, or you could force the candidate to create an account first and then log in and then apply. So there's a lot of flexibility in that. So this is what the candidate home looks like. So once they create an account, then they will have a welcome page, and then they will also have any of their pending tasks or the jobs they have applied for and the next steps. So this would be kind of a landing page for the candidate. So it's really helpful. So whether, and you get to select which statuses you're going to show to the candidate, and then you can have your own label. So internally, you might have different statuses, but you could map all of these to in progress. Like if you don't want to tell them that this is under review or screening or interview, you could do a mapping. So something more user friendly. And where you could put the banners. So this is helpful. And then for agency setup, things that you could allow their agency to do. So I'll go ahead and just post this on the elements so we can move on. And we talked about some of the security roles. There's a primary recruiter, secondary recruiter. And then as far as cutover strategy, like if your company is using an ATS currently, and then they're going to go to Workday, Workday recommends that you do a clean break. Instead of trying to import all of the data, you kind of sunset one application and then do a clean start with Workday. So there's some data that you may want to bring into Workday, but they would prefer it to be, try to bring in the least data as possible because it will add time and cost to the project. So here's what they recommend that what should be converted over. Like if they have like open recs and positions, that can be converted as part of the data conversion and brought into the new system. The candidate information, so like their name, address, contact info, skills and experience. So you could definitely bring it over, but the consulting company will actually charge a lot more for that. And then here's a list of things that they don't recommend to bring over, like their disposition history, notes, communication history, interview, like previous assessment or interview data. And then basically kind of going through what things to consider for the data conversion and the data migration strategy. So you guys can read that on your own. There's definitely local and global rules that you could implement. As far as integrations, whether you're going to have a background check and assessment or job boards by out of the box, even though there is a background check status, it really doesn't do anything unless you actually build a integration with the background check vendor. And then also any intranet or internet websites that you need to post your jobs to. And then finally, the whole change management and training to get people excited about the new features, etc. And then it's got some links on the community for those of you guys who have access to it. So I think this is a good resource. I'll post it on LMS. This is from Workday, but I think it's good to review and good stuff to talk about during the interview process. Okay, so yesterday we talked about some of these setups. Today I'm going to talk about what's called the recruiting hub. This is a major improvement that was launched only last year. So even if a company is on recruiting, if they didn't have time for it, they're probably not using the recruiting hub. Because you could definitely use recruiting without the recruiting hub. It does take a little bit of setup, but not a lot. But it is something that's very useful. So what recruiting hub is that if you're a recruiter or a manager, then you see this dashboard. It's like one place with all of your action items and all of your recruiting data. So let me make this one a little bit bigger. And you have this left-hand panel, and then you have this pipeline, and you have these what's called cards that you could move around. So let me give you a demo of that within the system, and then we'll talk about how to configure it. So this is called a recruiting hub. This means that it's like one place with all of this data. Prior to this, so this was introduced in, I believe, March or April of last year. Prior to this, you had a recruiting worklet. So either you had to use the reports to get the candidates, but there was no one place. And then you had to go to, the recruiter had to go to their inbox to find all of the items they had to do. But if you've seen the Workday inbox, right. If you have like 30 or 40 items in there, it's very hard to sort and filter and search. So it was very difficult for recruiters to use because they have to deal with hundreds of candidates. So it's hard to find their items in the inbox. So this was a huge improvement. So let me go into the system as a recruiter, and we'll see a demo of that. So while it's doing that, I'm just going to go through it based on this screenshot. On the recruiting hub, you'll see different areas at the bottom. These are called cards. So there's an offer card, referral cards. So this is basically all the items that are in the inbox that are related to offer. They will show up on the offer card. And the items that are on, this is basically it categorizes the items that are in the inbox by certain task categories, and that way it's easy to find who you need to act on. And you could actually, the end user, they could move these, how they want to line up the cards. They could add additional cards to it, or they could remove cards from it as well. And it's the end user configuration. It's not letting me go into the recruiting. It's not into the remote desktop. So let me try one more thing. Okay, I'm going to log into the Workday's GMS, and so at least we'll be able to go through the security setup for it. The domain that controls the security for this is called recruiting, and then from there we go to the recruiting hub security policy. So domain is the overall area, and business process security is the security for that transaction or for that workflow. So domain could be human resources, like who have access to personal data, but that doesn't determine who could initiate an address change. So the actual, when you're thinking of business process, think about the actual transaction, like who could do that transaction and who will approve that transaction. And the domain is who has access to the data within that function. If they don't have, yeah, I mean, there's going to be exceptions to it, but if they want to be able to just do the transaction, they will need business process security, but they will not be able to see the data if they don't have domain access to it. So it will be, while it's technically possible, but not really. Like, if you don't have access to the compensation domain, meaning you don't have access to people's salary, how can you do a job change? Right? Those fields will not show up, even though you have access to do the transaction. Okay, so we're going to go into the security domain for the recruiting hub, because that is new functionality. It may not be set up yet. So you have to go into, one way for me to remember this task name, I just call it domain fun area. So if you just think domain fun area, then the actual task name shows up, domain security policy for functional area. So, but just think of it as domain fun area, then it will show up. And then we're going to choose the recruiting functional area. So let that page load up.
Okay.
Okay, so now I finally logged into the remote desktop. But anyways, yeah, and this is still loading. Oh gosh. So let me just try here. Domain fund area. So here's the domain. There's a description of the whole domain, and these are all the subdomains within that. And the one we're interested in right now is the recruiting hub. So I'm going to try to find that. Okay, so here's the recruiting hub. Okay. And so in this case, since it's already active, someone has already, added in the security groups. But if it was not active, first you have to click here and you have to activate the domain. So right now it's already active, so the only choice is disable. If it was not active, then there will be a choice of activating it. You would need to activate it, and then you would edit the permissions, and you would add in the groups that will have access to it. So we see that the recruiter unconstrained group and manager unconstrained group has access to it. Some companies' issue they face is that this domain is only available to the unconstrained groups. So if you have HR admin or you have a recruiting administrator, which is a user-based group, they will not have access to the recruiter hub. And that's very frustrating for them because they want the administrator to have access to it, but unfortunately that's Workday constraint that they have built this domain only for the unconstrained groups and only recruiter and manager. So the recruiting assistant or the HR admin, they don't have access to that recruiting hub. But this is where you go to set it up for, at least for the recruiter and the manager. So now I will go ahead and ask the recruiter so we could actually see the recruiting hub. Okay. So this left-hand bar right here, this gives you access to the recruiting hub. And you could expand it by clicking on this arrow. So then it opens up and you have direct access to all of your recruiting activities. And you have this announcement and then the pipeline and the different cards. And this is built for, there's some default setup, that you could specify what are the default cards, but the end user has the power to move them. So you click here and then you have a choice, move or remove. So you click on move and then you could just move that card to a different location. You could also remove it, and I believe there's like 9 different cards. So once again, this is surfacing everything that's in your inbox, but it's on these cards so that it's easy to get to. So I'm not going to remove it. Let me just unclick out of that. And if I want to add a new card, you have to do it from here. There's this tiny link called Add Card. Okay, so in this case, I already have 10 cards. So let me remove a card and then I could add it. So I'm going to remove background check. Now I could add employment agreement task. So once an end user modifies this, the default setting is gone. You cannot go back to the default setting. And then you have this candidate list as well, which sorts them by their stage or any of the other columns that you want to. And this functionality called mass move, like you could select all of them and move them to a different stage. This functionality is also new. This was also rolled out in March of last year, so it's not even been 1 year since this functionality. But it's very helpful. Before that, you had to do one by one or by a particular org. And so this is called mass move. We saw how to move the cards. And then these are the shortcuts. So the shortcuts that you want to apply over here, this is also, there's a domain, and there's also a widget that allows you to select what the shortcut is going to be that you want to display over here for the recruiters. So just like we saw the domain for Recruiting Hub, there was also domains for all of these areas and where you actually maintain the setup. And this is still loading, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. So we talked about moving, removing, or adding new cards to it. This feature is role-based for recruiters only, not user-based groups. Okay, here's a screenshot of the domain. Okay, and then just like we saw the Recruiting Hub security policy, there's another one that you should be aware of. It's called Candidates for My Jobs. So if you give recruiter or admin access to that policy, then they will have access to the candidate menu item, the candidate cards, and the pipeline card. There's also the setup, tenant setup general, and this is the access that they will get if you add that role to the security policy. So it's good to be aware of. And then a couple of tasks as the Workday HRIS person or support person you should be aware of. So there's the configure default shortcuts, and then there's like the maintain hub where you could configure the announcements and such. So just a couple of tasks and domain policies. And this is just one little area, and there's like, we spent almost like an hour on it. So I do want to show a little bit of the onboarding. I'm going to kind of skip ahead to onboarding. because one of our students really wants to see that. So I'm going to kind of change gears and show the onboarding business process, and then we'll call it a day after that. So first of all, the business process has to be enabled in the system. That is a implementation level task, so we're not going to get into that. But the VP must be active, and if it is active, you could easily modify it. And the name of that is just onboarding. And if a company had made a copy of it, it might be onboarding for, Cisco, or onboarding for, whatever. You could also have separate onboarding process for each organization or even a cost center. So that's why we see so many different versions of it. Typically, it just makes sense to have like one or two versions of it based on the country. Or even you could even just have one and then put in the conditional rules so that you only go to the steps based on the country requirements. So I'm looking for the onboarding default definition from here. Okay. So this business process controls what the pre-hire sees when they have accepted the offer. So once they have accepted the offer, now they're a pre-hire and they could come into Workday and they could do these tasks that are listed here. But as part of the business process, if you want to see who could initiate this, the initiating groups will be listed here, and there should be a pre-hire or employee as self should be listed here somewhere. In the real world, you will have not just the HR partner, but you will actually have the employee or the pre-hire. So there should be another group here called pre-hire, and then you should also have an employee as self as the initiating as part of the group. And the steps that are available to them. Let me make this bigger. You need some user to kick it off. But once it's kicked off, then based on the type of person, like whether it's a contingent worker or employee, they will get a task. All of them will get it, if it's a contingent worker or employee, they will get a task to enter their personal information. And then they will enter their contact information. And there's also the complete I-9. This is an action. So if a company chooses to do I-9 through Workday, all they have to do is add this step within the onboarding business process. And then Workday has a built-in condition that this step will only trigger to employees, not contractors. And then it would only trigger if the primary job is located in the US and the person is not a rehire. So there's really no additional thing you have to do. If you have this step within the business process, then when the employee gets to this step, they see the I-9, the electronic online version of the I-9 form, and they fill that out, and then they submit it. And which the like the immigration person has to do. They have to like visually check the passport or driver's license. But as far as the entering the information is, as long as you have the security set up to view the form, there's no additional things that you need to do. And then after that, there have the change benefit elections and so on. So if you look at some of the other onboarding processes, they don't have the I-9 in it. So I think I got disconnected from the remote server because it's not responding. What I was going to show was you go into the business process, and from the related actions, those three dots, you click on them, and then you could edit the business process, and then you could click on the plus button and add the I-9 step, or if you choose not to do the I-9 through Workday, you could just click on the minus and remove the step. I think we could demo it. We just need to create a new hire and then bring them up to the onboarding steps. So maybe in some of for the business processes, like the workflows, the task is you actually have to go to the BP, and under the related actions, there is a business process security configuration. So the security for the BP is actually on the BP itself, underneath the related actions. So you modify it by navigating to the BP itself.